William shut down the Windsor summit after spotting Camilla's lawyer, and no one expected why. So, here's something that isn't supposed to happen in a family that prides itself on seamless, calculated control. A future king walks into a private summit at Windsor Castle. Months of preparation. Every senior royal scheduled to attend. The entire gathering built around settling a deep, year-long dispute before time runs out. And before anyone can even draw a chair or break the ice, he shuts the whole thing down. Not after a heated row. Not midway through. In under 60 seconds. And he did it, by every account, because of a single face in that room. Someone who wasn't on the official guest list. Someone whose presence told William in a single glance that this was never the family catch-up he'd been promised, it was a trap. That face belonged to Queen Camilla's personal private solicitor. And the moment William clocked who she was, he turned around and closed the book on the entire summit. Hit subscribe before we go any further, because why a single private lawyer in a quiet room can detonate a royal summit is the most revealing look you will ever get into how this family actually operates behind closed doors. I'm Harold, and on this channel, we don't just give you the headline, we pull back the heavy red velvet curtains to inspect the cold machinery underneath. Who was in the room? What was written on that undisclosed paperwork? And which silent move changed the balance of power? The word summit is doing massive heavy lifting when applied to the royal family. A summit is a rare, deliberate, heavily planned tactical gathering convened only when something genuinely needs to be resolved and normal channels have utterly failed. There is clear precedent for this theatrical showdown. In January 2020, when Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back, the family held the Sandringham Summit. Charles, William, Harry, and the late Queen sat in one room hammering out the terms of an exit. That set the ultimate template. When stakes are existential, you get everyone in one room and settle it face to face. So when word went round that a Windsor summit was being arranged, everyone who understood how this family operates recognized the flashing red signal. This time, the subject was not a rebellious prince running off to California. The subject was the future itself, specifically, the shape of the family, the distribution of power, and fiercely guarded arrangements once Charles is no longer on the throne. The grim backdrop made this feel intensely urgent. Charles was diagnosed with cancer in early 2024. That devastating diagnosis changed the emotional temperature inside the household completely. Questions about who controls what empire and where certain figures stand stopped being theoretical debating points. They acquired a ticking clock. Nothing focuses a family with massive inherited wealth and power to lose quite like a clock they cannot stop or negotiate with. That is the pressure this summit was born out of. A rising tide of realization that the window to lock down certain guarantees was rapidly closing. Choosing Windsor as the battleground was a deliberate, psychological choice. A meeting at Buckingham Palace is formal state business. A meeting at Clarence House is Charles's own turf. Windsor is the old, beating heart of the family, a setting reached for when they want something to feel less like government policy and much more like blood. Choosing Windsor offered the illusion of intimacy, whispering to everyone involved to come as a son, not as a rival claimant. That precise framing was not innocent. The more a room is dressed up to feel like family, the lower your psychological guard drops, which was the entire strategic point of the exercise. The summit was framed as a simple, informal family conversation among senior members and trusted advisors where difficult things could be discussed casually off the record. This atmospheric trap was designed to be warm, trusting, and disarming. However, William had been given a guest list in advance, and a specific lawyer's name was entirely absent from it. She had either been added at the 11th hour or deliberately left off the ledger all along. The operational plan actively depended on William remaining completely in the dark about her presence until he was trapped inside the room. If her presence were innocent, she would have been listed proudly. You only hide things that will blow up in your face. Things that only work if the other person does not see them coming until it is too late to back out. Someone high up understood that if William knew a private litigator would be sitting in the corner, he would never walk through those doors. William walked into that sunlit room and immediately spotted a figure standing near the tall window who did not belong in a family conversation, Camilla's personal solicitor. This was not a neutral palace legal advisor serving the crown impartially, but a hired gun representing Camilla's private financial and property interests. That single detail changed the entire physics of the room. There is an unbridgeable chasm between a casual family conversation and a binding legal proceeding, and the one thing separating them is the quiet presence of a lawyer. The moment a private solicitor is standing by the window, the gathering transforms into a high-stakes legal deposition. Anything uttered from that second onward becomes potential evidence that can be recorded, witnessed, and referred back to in future court battles. An informal nod or polite gesture stops being familial warmth and hardens into something a lawyer can describe as verbal consent. William looked at that woman and understood in less than a heartbeat that he had been lured into a room disguised as one thing to manufacture something completely different. In a single glance, he saw a face he recognized, noted her omission from the official guest list, and realized the setup spelled one word: ambush. He did not need anyone to whisper in his ear or read a printed agenda. The mere unannounced presence of that specific individual was the entire agenda. He read the hidden plot off one face before his shoes had taken 3 steps onto the rug. That level of hypervigilance shows a family dynamic so hollowed out and paranoid that a lawyer's presence reads instantly as a confirmed, hostile trap. It exposes a high-level institutional battlefield where one side fundamentally assumes the other is always working an underground angle. William understood with absolute finality that he had been invited into a space engineered to trap him. The trap was not hidden in what was going to be said out loud, the trap was the physical room itself. If he sat down, engaged in dialogue, and let the conversation proceed with that private lawyer quietly observing, then any momentary softening of tone or diplomatic ambiguity could later be legally framed as his official consent, witnessed and certified by licensed counsel. The only way to defeat a trap built out of the architecture of a room is to utterly refuse to enter it. So that is precisely what he did without a moment of hesitation. He did not start a screaming match or demand dramatic explanations. He stated flatly that the meeting was cancelled, turned on his heel, and walked straight out the door, ruthlessly stripping away the one element the elaborate exercise depended upon, him sitting in a chair playing their game. By these insider accounts, the summit's true purpose was continuity, a soft corporate term that meant securing Camilla's position, massive property portfolios, staff, privileges, and political standing beyond the expiration date of Charles's reign. It meant making the temporary permanent, locking it in stone while Charles was still king and possessed enough executive authority to bless it, creating an ironclad structure that would carry Camilla's dominant place forward into an era where William would hold absolute power. A formal legal move would require William's explicit, notarized sign-off, which he would reject. But an informal family summit, with a lawyer quietly observing from the periphery, could manufacture the illusion of consensus. A witness statement that the family had talked it through and William had gone along with it to keep the peace. The continuity arrangement bundled together a toxic cocktail of demands, absolute legal certainty over which royal residences and private country comforts Camilla would retain as a widow, a legally protected executive role, and an ongoing measure of institutional involvement or veto power in overarching family matters after Charles was gone. From William's perspective as the incoming sovereign, a previous king's widow holding a pre-agreed, legally binding claim on prime royal residences and executive roles is a suffocating mortgage taken out on his own future reign. The only time to secure such a one-sided deal is while Charles is still alive and sitting on the throne, making any refusal by William look like a cruel son torturing a dying father's final wish. The ticking clock was the ultimate strategic weapon, lock it in stone before power shifts, because the second power transfers to the new monarch, the answer to every demand becomes a permanent no. This situation reflects a deeply complex human conflict on all sides. For Camilla, the fear is real and primal. The moment Charles dies, her situation changes overnight from queen consort, at the epicenter of power, to a dowager queen facing a sharp drop in institutional support, grand homes, and taxpayer-funded protection. Her entire future suddenly depends on the goodwill of a stepson, who has no logical reason to be generous. Wanting to lock things down in legal concrete before her leverage vanishes is a desperate human attempt to build a fortress before the storm hits. For Charles, an aging husband facing his own mortality, lending his weight to the summit was an attempt to ensure the woman he loved would be safe, protected, and financially secure when he was gone. For William, the reaction was driven by the towering ghost of his past. Having spent his life watching the cold institution manipulate outcomes behind soft words and closed doors, he has never trusted it. The last time the family arranged things quietly behind the scenes to protect institutional comfort, the person on the wrong end of that machine was his mother, Diana. Walking into a room full of diplomatic words and a hidden lawyer was the machine wearing the comforting face of family to execute a maneuver. His refusal to play along was an involuntary biological instinct, a severe allergy to being managed. Walking out of that door was not cold petulance, but a resolute refusal to ever be handled by the institution again. When William turned around and walked out of that room, he did not just abort a meeting. He shattered a months-long psychological operation that was meticulously crafted to back him into a corner. To understand why his departure sent absolute shockwaves through the royal household, you have to look at what was supposed to happen the moment his body settled into that chair. The entire architecture of the Windsor summit relied on a specific psychological lever, the weaponization of filial duty. With King Charles facing an uncertain medical timeline, the expectation was that William would be too emotionally compromised, too deeply respectful of his ailing father, to raise a loud objection in front of guests. The presence of Camilla's personal solicitor was meant to act as a silent recording device, capturing every polite nod, every diplomatic hesitation, and every soft concession William might offer just to avoid stressing the king. In the high-stakes world of aristocratic legalism, verbal acquiescence witnessed by licensed counsel can be transformed into a formidable weapon. Camilla's legal team did not need a signed contract bearing William's official royal cipher on day one. What they desperately needed was an established baseline of agreement, a documented record stating that the future king had sat in a room, heard the proposed arrangements regarding property, funding, and ongoing institutional influence, and offered no formal objection. Once that baseline was recorded by a solicitor, any attempt by William to reverse those terms after ascending the throne could be framed as a ruthless, cold-hearted betrayal of his late father's explicit wishes. It was a strategy designed to build a moral and legal cage around his future reign before he ever had the chance to wear the crown. By simply refusing to sit down, William dismantled that cage before the lock could engage. He recognized instantly that the most dangerous thing he could do in that moment was to be polite. In ordinary social interactions, politeness is a virtue. In institutional warfare, politeness is consent. Had he taken a seat, exchanged pleasantries, and gently suggested discussing the legal matters at a later date, the solicitor by the window would have documented that he engaged with the agenda. The meeting would have been logged as a successful initial consultation. By cutting the entire event off at the 60-second mark, William ensured there was no meeting to log, no conversation to record, and no ambient consensus to claim. He left behind a room full of orchestrated expectations and zero legal material to work with. The immediate aftermath inside the walls of Windsor was defined by a heavy, suffocating silence. According to insiders, there was no explosive shouting match following his exit, no dramatic slamming of ancient doors, and no emotional scene that could be leaked to friendly royal reporters to damage William's public standing. And that restraint was perhaps his most lethal tactical decision. In the modern era, the media strategy of palace factions often relies heavily on managing narrative framing. If William had lost his temper, accused Camilla of a conspiracy, or engaged in a shouting match with his father, the narrative leaked to the press the following morning would have been effortless to construct. He would have been depicted as an unstable, aggressive, and hot-headed prince bullying an ailing monarch and a devoted stepmother. The sympathy of the public and the court would have swung dramatically against him. Instead, his absolute composure deprived the other side of a usable narrative. You cannot easily leak a story about a man who remained entirely calm, spoke in a measured tone, and simply stated that an unannounced legal presence made the gathering inappropriate. By refusing to give them an emotional outburst, he denied them the weapon of public victimhood. The silence he left behind was impossible to spin. Charles, Camilla, and the private solicitor were left standing in an empty room, holding an undisclosed agenda that had been completely exposed under the cold light of day. The strategy had relied entirely on surprise and emotional leverage, and once those two elements were stripped away, the entire apparatus collapsed in on itself. In the hours that followed, the true gravity of what had transpired began to sink in across the various royal households. This was not merely a disagreement over scheduling or guest lists, it was a fundamental power shift between the current reign and the next. For months, the narrative within the inner circle had been that Charles's authority as king would naturally allow him to settle all remaining family affairs and secure his wife's long-term future without serious resistance. William's swift refusal of the room served as a sharp, unyielding reminder of where the ultimate power in the institution actually lies over a long horizon. A reigning monarch holds the power of the present, but the heir holds the power of the future. The moment an heir demonstrates that he is willing to veto the arrangements being made for his own future reign, the authority of the present monarch hits an immovable wall. This showdown also exposed the profound rift regarding how the family views its own operations. For Charles and Camilla's team, utilizing a private solicitor in a family setting was seen as a pragmatic, defensive shortcut, a way to build a protective wall around a vulnerable queen consort before the political landscape shifted permanently. They viewed it as a necessary measure driven by the harsh realities of royal transitions. But to William, that shortcut represented a dangerous erosion of institutional integrity. He viewed the secret introduction of private counsel as a direct violation of basic trust and a return to the exact dark, backroom maneuvering that had torn his family apart in decades past. The ghost of the 1990s loomed large over the entire incident. William grew up watching the institutional machine operate behind closed doors, watching lawyers, public relations advisors, and palace courtiers manipulate narratives and engineer outcomes at the expense of individuals. He saw firsthand how disarming words and informal settings were used to strip his mother of her standing, her protection, and ultimately her place within the royal structure. Walking into a room at Windsor and spotting an unannounced private lawyer was not an abstract administrative issue for him, it was a direct echo of the very playbook that had traumatized his youth. His immediate refusal to participate was an instinct forged through years of watching how the institutional machine operates when it thinks no one is paying attention. By standing his ground and walking out, William did more than just protect his future executive authority as sovereign. He set a precedent that permanently altered the internal rules of the household. He signaled to every advisor, courtier, and family member that the future reign will not be managed through backdoor maneuvers or manipulated family gatherings. If the current administration wishes to negotiate terms regarding properties, titles, or post-reign arrangements, those negotiations will have to take place out in the open, with formal agendas, full disclosure, and transparent legal representation for all parties involved. The era of disguising high-stakes legal negotiations as cozy afternoon teas came to an abrupt, permanent end in under 60 seconds at Windsor Castle. This decisive move sent a clear message across the entire royal infrastructure: the heir to the throne will not be maneuvered, emotional leverage will not yield legal concessions, and any attempt to quietly engineer the future of the monarchy behind closed doors will be met with absolute, unyielding resistance. The fallout from the aborted Windsor summit quickly spread beyond the walls of the castle, sending profound tremors through every corridor of the royal establishment. What had been intended as a quiet, decisive maneuver to lock down Camilla's long-term status transformed overnight into a stark demonstration of institutional deadlock. The failure of the trap left the inner circle exposed, forcing every major faction within the palace machinery to recalibrate their strategies. For the first time in Charles's reign, the silent power dynamic between the sitting king and the heir to the throne was laid completely bare, revealing an undeniable truth: the future of the monarchy would not be dictated by the dying embers of the current administration, but by the iron resolve of the man waiting to take the crown. In the days following the incident, the atmosphere across the various royal households shifted from quiet tension to cold, systematic isolation. Communications between Clarence House and Kensington Palace, which had already been strained, broke down into strictly formal, vetted exchanges managed exclusively through senior private secretaries. There were no more spontaneous phone calls, no casual family updates, and no attempts to soften the blow through informal diplomacy. William had made his boundary absolute. By walking out of Windsor Castle, he had demonstrated that he was fully prepared to cut off informal contact entirely if those channels were going to be used as Trojan horses for hidden legal agendas. For Camilla and her legal advisors, the collapsed summit was a devastating tactical disaster. The strategy had relied on taking advantage of a single, narrow window of opportunity, while Charles still held the authority of the reigning monarch. With that window rapidly closing and William's defenses now raised to maximum alert, the prospect of securing sweeping, legally binding guarantees for her post-reign future vanished. Her team had attempted a high-risk gamble to bypass formal protocol, and in doing so, they had permanently lost the element of surprise. Any future proposal regarding her residences, financial security, or ongoing institutional role would now have to pass through a brutal gauntlet of formal scrutiny, where William held total veto power over anything affecting his upcoming reign. The collapse of the plan also placed King Charles in an agonizing position, caught between his devotion as a husband and his duty as a monarch. Charles had spent decades attempting to build a secure, respectable place for Camilla within the institution, fighting public hostility, media skepticism, and deep family resistance. Seeing that entire lifetime project brought to a sudden halt by his own son was a crushing emotional blow. Yet, as a monarch deeply versed in the history and preservation of the crown, Charles also understood the terrifying clarity of William's move. The heir was not merely being stubborn, he was asserting the absolute primacy of the sovereign line. In the cold logic of royal succession, the survival and authority of the future king will always override the personal wishes or comfort of a passing reign. This fundamental clash exposed a deep philosophical divide over what the modern monarchy is supposed to represent. For the older generation, trained in the tradition of backroom compromises and discreet courtier maneuvers, utilizing an unannounced solicitor to quietly solve a complex family problem seemed like standard administrative practice. It was how the firm had managed uncomfortable realities for generations, behind drawn curtains, over warm tea, with quiet legal instruments drawn up far away from public view. But to William, that archaic method of governance was precisely what had damaged the institution's credibility and inflicted immense personal trauma on his own mother. He represents a modern, uncompromising standard where backroom deals are recognized for what they truly are: manipulative traps designed to protect personal interests at the expense of long-term integrity. William's refusal to allow private litigators to dictate the terms of his future reign also sent a powerful signal to the broader network of palace courtiers and advisors. For decades, senior staff members within the royal machine had operated under the assumption that